Ethnographic content analysis. What is it? How is it different from other types of content analysis? What are some of the issues around it? There are a lot of questions there, and I'm going to answer all of them in this video. The first part of the video is all about understanding ethnographic content analysis. What's it all about? The second part of the video is going to be looking at how we actually do it. Before we dive in, if we've not met before, hi, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Yardley, and I help doctoral students get out of their own way and finish their PhD. Qualitative methods are definitely my jam, and I've made a whole load of videos about them, and I'll link to that playlist up here. So, without further ado, ethnographic content analysis, or ECA as the insiders call it. Let's get into it. In today's world, we are constantly bombarded with information from all sorts of places. News articles, social media, TV. And it's important to try and understand what's really being communicated. Many people's PhDs focus on getting to the bottom of all this stuff, especially in the social sciences and related disciplines. And this is where ethnographic content analysis, or ECA, can come in. ECA is a way of studying documents and media that focuses on understanding those deeper meanings and contexts that lie behind the words, that lie behind what's being communicated. Essentially, it's about reading between the lines. It's about digging underneath the surface. Unlike some of the traditional methods, like quantitative content analysis, which focus on measuring things, so they might count the number of times something is mentioned within a text, ECA digs deeper to explore those rich and those complex messages that are being conveyed. So, whilst quantitative content analysis looks at what's happening on the surface, ECA digs a bit deeper and gets right into the roots of an issue. So it's really well suited to people who sit within paradigms like critical realism, and I recently did a video on that. I'll link to it up here. It's a way of analysing content by combining those traditional ideas from things like quantitative content analysis with ideas from ethnography. And what this does is that it enables researchers to explore the deeper meanings and the context of what's being conveyed, of what's being communicated. Now, in terms of the word ethnographic within ethnographic content analysis, we've got to understand why that's there. Ethnography involves studying people and their cultures by observing and interacting with them in their everyday lives, essentially by hanging around with them. And you know exactly what I'm going to say now. I've done another video on that. I'll link to it up here. And ECA stays true to these ethnographic principles by the researcher essentially immersing themselves in the context of the content. Did I say that properly? The context of the content. I think I did. Essentially considering the social and the cultural dynamics that are at play. For instance, when analysing a set of newspaper articles about a political event, an ECA researcher would not only look at the content of those articles, they'd also consider the political climate, the publication's biases, and the historical context in which those articles were written. We also need to understand how ECA is different from quantitative content analysis. That approach is more rigid and structured. It involves carefully marking up and counting particular parts of the text in order to test ideas, and it typically involves a progression from data collection to data analysis. It focuses on reliability. It uses predefined categories. In contrast, ECA is reflective and circular. The researcher allows new categories to be developed throughout the research process. It's a much less linear process. It is quite untidy, it's quite messy. For example, in a quantitative content analysis study, a researcher might count the number of times that a particular keyword appears in political speeches to help them determine the frequency of particular themes. In an ethnographic content analysis study, on the other hand, the researcher would look beyond the keywords. They'd want to understand the context and the tone and the underlying messages in those speeches. And whilst we're on the topic of examples and where ECA might be used, you might find it cropping up in places like these. It's often used in media studies to look at how news outlets cover events, uncovering biases and the framing of issues in particular ways. It also crops up in sociology. Sociologists can use ECA to examine how power works and how different groups of people relate to each other. In anthropology, ethnographic content analysis can be useful for studying cultural artifacts and documents, like letters or diaries or even tools or implements that people used. It can help generate insights into why particular cultural practices are important and what they actually mean. And we've kind of touched on this example already, but political science often makes use of ECA too. It can be really enlightening for looking at political speeches to examine how politicians talk to people, how they persuade people. It gives us insights into people's plans, people's beliefs, how they use power, how they rally others around them. Now, before we get on to how to do ECA, I want to hear from you in the comments. What are your thoughts so far? So knowing what you know, would you consider using ECA in your study? So drop me a yes, a no, or a maybe in the comments, because I'd really love to know where you're all sitting on this one at the moment. Next up, we're going to look at how we actually do ECA. So let me walk you through it. Step 1 involves defining the research question. The first step in any ECA study is to clearly define your research question. This question should guide the entire research process. It's going to be really helpful for the researcher to focus their analysis and to interpret their findings. For example, a researcher who's interested in media representations of climate change might ask this question: how do different news outlets frame the issue of climate change in their coverage? The second step is all about selecting items for analysis. Once you've defined the research question, the next thing you're going to do is select the documents or content that you're going to analyse. This involves identifying relevant texts that are going to contain rich data to help you answer that research question. This can include newspapers, magazines, online articles, social media posts, and other forms of communication. For example, if a researcher was studying the portrayal of mental health in television soap operas, what they might do is select a number of episodes where there's a storyline about mental health from different soap operas. The third step is about immersing yourself in the context. As I mentioned earlier, immersing yourself in the context of what you're studying is an essential part of ethnographic content analysis, and this very much brings to the fore the ethnographic element of it. The researcher needs to understand the cultural, the social, and the historical background of what it is they're studying. This involves conducting a really thorough literature review, gathering background information, and considering the broader context within which what they're studying was produced. So if a researcher is studying political speeches, they need to be really familiar with the political climate, the key issues, and the public sentiments that were about when those speeches were delivered. Step 4 is about developing initial categories. So here we need to develop some initial categories to code the data. These categories should be based on the research question, and they should also be based on your preliminary review of the documents you're studying, or the TV episodes, or the political speeches, or whatever it is you're studying. So you're developing a set of categories to go in with, but it's really important that you remain flexible, because you need to be open to new categories that you might spot as you're doing the analysis. For example, in a study about online discussions of healthcare, some of the initial categories might include access to care, cost of treatment, patient experience. Step 5 is all about coding the data. So coding essentially involves identifying and categorizing relevant information. This process helps to organize the data, and it helps to identify patterns and themes in the data. And in ECA, coding is an iterative process. The researcher continuously refines their categories, they continuously refine their interpretations. So for example, you might be a marketing researcher and you might be coding customer reviews of a product. You might identify codes like product quality, customer service, value for money. Now, just a quick word for those of you who are wondering how coding is different from developing categories. This is a really common question. So developing initial categories is about creating like a starter set of labels. And those are based on your research question and your first look at the data. Coding, on the other hand, is the process of organising pieces of information based on those categories. It's the application of those categories. It's kind of like organising a closet or a wardrobe. Developing initial categories is like deciding that you want to organise your clothes into general categories like jeans, shorts, jackets, shoes. Coding the data is like going through each item of clothing in your wardrobe and putting them into one of those groups. And as you do this, you might realise that you need more specific categories. So instead of just having shirts, you might want to have long sleeve shirts, short sleeve shirts. So you adjust your categories to better organise everything. Anyway, let's get back to that step by step and the next stage in the process. Step 6 is all about analysing the data. This involves looking at the coded data to identify patterns, themes, and meanings. This process focuses on the stories and the meanings within the documents. The researcher should look out for common themes that crop up quite often, unique details that stand out, and important differences that can provide new insights. For instance, in a study about public responses to government policy, the researcher might analyse things like this: the tone, the language, the arguments that are used in different types of responses, like letters to the editor in a newspaper, comments on social media, things said in public forums. Step 7 is about writing narrative descriptions. A key feature of ECA is the use of narrative description to present the findings. These descriptions provide a really detailed account of the themes and of the patterns discovered during the analysis. They offer insights into those social and those cultural dynamics that are reflected in the documents, or whatever it is that the person's been analysing. It doesn't always have to be documents. Narrative descriptions are really good at allowing the researcher to convey just how deep and just how rich and just how complex the data is. For example, in a study about online forums, a researcher might provide really detailed narrative data about user interactions, highlighting the different perspectives and the different tones of emotion that they can see in the different discussions. And lastly, step 8, reflexive analysis. Throughout the ECA process, researchers need to engage in reflexive analysis. This involves critically examining their own role, their own biases, their own influence on the research. Reflexivity is really important in ECA because it helps to ensure that the research is transparent and that it's ethical. For example, a researcher who was studying gender representation in adverts should reflect on how things like their own gender identity and their own gendered experiences might impact upon their interpretation of that data. Now let's take a look at 3 of the key issues that often crop up around ECA. Firstly, subjectivity. But this one very much depends on your research paradigm. Paradigms like interpretivism and critical realism, they value subjectivity, they see it as an asset, but positivism doesn't take quite the same view. Positivists try and minimise subjectivity, they try and kind of remove it altogether. Because ECA relies heavily on the researcher's interpretation, there is the risk that those individual biases, those personal subjectivities are going to impact on the findings. However, ECA has a mechanism built into it for this very thing. It's that final step we looked at, that reflexivity step. So it's kind of got that covered, okay? But subjectivity, criticism of it being subjective, that is always something that comes up in ECA, so just watch out for that. The second issue is data overload. ECA can generate a large amount of qualitative data, and that can make it quite challenging to manage it and to analyse it effectively. So you need to be realistic about what you can actually analyse, and you need to have a plan for this. And that might involve looking at some qualitative data analysis software if you think that your study is going to generate a huge amount of data that you're never going to be able to analyse just with your highlighters and your pens and your sticky notes. There are quite a lot of different software packages that are available for analysing qualitative data. The one that I'm most familiar with is NVivo, so I will drop a link to a video about NVivo in the description. And thirdly, ethical considerations. ECA might involve analysing content that could contain sensitive or confidential information. So you need to make sure that you are adhering to the ethical guidelines of your subject area. You need to make sure that you have the necessary permissions to access the content that you're analysing. You also need to make sure that you've taken steps to protect the privacy of the individuals or the organisations that are included in the content that you're analysing. For example, if you're analysing social media posts, you need to make sure that you anonymise any personal information about the people whose posts that you're analysing. ECA is a really versatile method that can be considered for a whole range of different studies, so do consider it for your qualitative research. And speaking of qualitative studies, there's a video popping up on your screen right now that I think you'll enjoy if you're leaning towards qualitative research. So go and check it out. I'll see you over there.